artillery, these warbirds sought out prey with a merciless accuracy and unleashed a new word on the English language, blitzkrieg. Conceived in secret, perfected in battle, destroyed by its creators, the Luftwaffe, next on Modern Marvels.
Kamerad, Kamerad, der Befehl ist da, wir starten. Kamerad, Kamerad, alle Mädels müssen warten. Die Losung ist bekannt, ran an den Feind, Bomben auf England. That was, of course, every day in the Armed Forces news and came this England song, you know. And that was, of course, how they prepared the people for really to be concerned about that.
In the final months of World War II, Luftwaffe pilots fighting against great odds took to the air to stop the Allied bomber raids against the heartland of the Third Reich.
We always had to take off when they came to central Germany. And then we were let into the bomber formation from the front. We stayed away from rear attacks because they were too costly. We were probably 20, 30 109s and Focke-Wulfs spread out. And we went in and parts were flying all over. I saw parachutes, I saw planes, fighters going into the bombers, ramming, and not willfully, you know, yes, that happened. It was so crowded, you could not move left, you could not move right, and in front of you was a bomber, and it was often too late to pull up. Now, I was lucky enough to be on the outer right-hand side in this attack, and they got me this B-17. I saw it was burning pretty good, and then I have a funny feeling and looked up half to the northeast of me, high up, Mustangs coming down on me, you know. So I concentrated on the Mustangs. Well, I had still the chance to make a left and go down and let them follow me. And that didn't feel right. So I aimed at the first one and opened up with all I had. We were damn close. We passed each other. The Mustang exploded behind me. That was nothing but a fireball. And the rest followed me and gave me hell. From every side they attacked me. God, they chased me to the center of Germany. They hit me pretty good in the undercarriage, you know, and in the left wing. But they didn't bring me down. I made a crash landing, more or less, you know. Any crash landing, as long as you survive, is a good one. We were feeling pretty strong, you know, and fear is not the right word. You fly, you do what you have to do, and if it happens, it happens. One day your number is up. That's how we saw it.
Throughout the war, the German airmen flew with great skill and determination. German industry had built for them some of the best flying machines in the world. Yet Hitler's Air Force had ruled the continent of Europe for not much more than a year. It was an Air Force built for a short war by short-sighted leaders. The victorious Allies of the First World War signed the Treaty of Versailles in June of 1919 and called for an end to German military aviation. Under the supervision of an Allied Control Commission, Germany was obliged to surrender all of her nearly 15,000 aircraft to the Allies. But the treaty put only minor limitations on the development of civil aviation. German aircraft manufacturers moved their factories out of the country, far from the nuisance of Allied commissions.
Junkers became a large company. They built airplanes in Russia. Henkel established a factory in Sweden. There was a Dornier factory in Switzerland. And they had to build a first generation of aircraft to really relearn how to build modern aircraft. And that was done at a considerable secret expenditure of marks.
In 1933, Adolf Hitler, as Germany's newly elected chancellor, further encouraged the secret development of military aircraft, and soon began to gather the men who would fly for the Reich.
When I was 14, I had the opportunity to join the flying group of the Hitler Youth. And that consisted of a weekly workshop activity. Each boy had to learn how to glue gliders together. And after so many hours of workshop time, we were then entitled to, it didn't cost any money, but we were entitled to participate in actual flight activity. The first flight was a solo flight. The first flight was, for a 14-year-old boy, it was a fantastic achievement, you know, to fly, to actually be in the air.
It was like nothing in the world felt before, you know, for us youngsters. It was just fun. So I was gung-ho for it.
By 1935, Hitler felt secure enough with his power to publicly announce the existence of his air weapon, the Luftwaffe. To command his force of 1,800 aircraft and some 20,000 men, Hitler appointed a former World War I fighter ace.
Hermann Goering was a ruthless organizer, and he had the capacity to force people to take brave decisions and take responsibility for them. So he was able to induce manufacturers to spend a lot more money than they had any idea that they'd ever be able to spend. Money was no object. So by designing their airplanes beginning in 1934, testing them, introducing them into production in 1937, by the time the war came, Hitler had the most modern air force in the world.
With the power of their war machine growing, Hermann Goering and Adolf Hitler managed to intimidate European leaders and won their territorial claims to Austria and Czechoslovakia without a fight. By the summer of 1939, Luftwaffe's strength stood at 3,700 aircraft and 1.5 million men. With nothing to stand in their way, Hitler and Goering turned to more violent methods. On the morning of September 1st, under cover of heavy fog, soldiers of the German army moved east and rushed across the frontier border of Poland. Armored forces stormed through the defenses as the Luftwaffe hammered all resistance. The Blitzkrieg had begun. The rapid German advance had left behind many pockets of resistance in rear areas. The Luftwaffe offered direct support to the army by bombing these Polish strongpoints. It was here that the legend of the Stuka dive bomber was born.
The Junkers Ju-87 was a large, gull-winged airplane with fixed gear and able to dive very close to the ground, and consequently were very accurate. At that time, there were no level bombers in the world that were really effective. Level bombers didn't hit their targets. Level bombers often didn't find their targets. Whereas the Stukas were like a well-keyed-in artillery piece. They blasted in and would hit exactly. The Stukas would appear over a point precisely when the tanks wanted them to be, would attack, and while the enemy was still stunned from the concussive effect of the bombs, the armored forces would be there to exploit the opening.
The accuracy of the Stuka's attacks was devastating and demoralizing, but a simple makeshift device further heightened the Stuka's psychological effect on the enemy.
They had pipes, actually. Simple pipes from cardboard paper at the side of the bombs. And these pipes made a terrible noise, like a siren, you know. And that was in the beginning, in the Polish War particularly. And the troops heard those sirens, they put the nose down in the dirt.
Medium bombers like the Heinkel HE-111 bombed the airfields of the obsolete Polish Air Force. What aircraft did make it into combat were no match for the guns of the Luftwaffe. In 2 days, Göring's Air Force had won complete supremacy of the sky. The destruction of road and rail networks stopped Polish reinforcements from reaching the front. The success and rapidity of the advance staggered even the Germans. In 8 days, the panzer divisions had reached the outskirts of Warsaw. A few days later, the last Polish counteroffensive had been halted and destroyed. On September 27th, the Polish capital surrendered. The first lightning campaign was over.
The German armed forces learned wonderful lessons in the execution of combined ground-air tactics in the assault on Poland. The aircraft that they had were perfect for the job, and they were opposed by a brave enemy. The Polish troops were brave, but totally unsuited for modern warfare.
On Germany's western border, the Maginot Line stood as France's only defense against the threat of invasion. A maze of bunkers and heavy gun emplacements, the line was built in a time when armies moved into combat by foot and on horseback. Nothing, the French believed, could pass in front of the guns of the Maginot Line and survive. But Hitler had no intention of passing within the range of French guns. His strategy, Plan Yellow, would exploit the mobility of his army to outflank the fixed defenses and attack the Maginot Line from the rear. At first light on May 10, 1940, 74 divisions of Hitler's army thrust through Belgium and Holland. The main thrust of the attack against Holland came from the Luftwaffe. Medium bombers, including the Junkers Ju-88, began with the now familiar tactic of destroying enemy airfields. The Ju-88 could carry over 3 tons of high-explosive bombs distributed between its internal bomb bay and wing pylons. Its excellent speed, great maneuverability, and immense structural strength made the Ju-88 a rugged and accurate dive bomber. But light defensive armament made this twin-engined bomber vulnerable to enemy fighter attack. As bombers pounded the Dutch countryside, a fleet of 475 3-engine Junkers Ju-52 troop transports swept into the country. Before the war, the Ju-52 was used as a civilian airliner. The Junkers transport planes brought to the battlefield a new combat force, paratroopers. The aircraft flew in a tight formation of 3 aircraft at 150 miles per hour, 400 feet above the ground. Speed was reduced to about 100 miles per hour for the men to jump. After they were out, containers full of arms and ammunition were also dropped. German paratroops landed on air bases, supply areas, and key bridges throughout the small country. By early afternoon, 1,200 airborne soldiers had won control of the major airfields. By May 13th, only the city of Rotterdam remained in Dutch control. Göring ordered the bombing of Rotterdam as a show of force to hasten the surrender of the Dutch. The heart of the city was completely destroyed. Armored columns drove through Belgium almost unopposed, and in 2 days, Hitler's panzers reached the French border. The Germans crossed the Meuse River, and Blitzkrieg poured into France. The German shock troops faced a disorganized enemy. The Luftwaffe quickly gained air superiority. As they had done in the battle for Poland, Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers hunted and attacked. When they encountered heavy resistance, German ground forces called on the Stukas to bomb targets with the accuracy of flying artillery. Luftwaffe radio operators provided the valuable link.
We created the connection between the army and the flying units. That was a time when the close communication between ground troops and Air Force was developed. And unfortunately, when we came to Dunkirk, where all this was supposed to take place, we couldn't put it to work because of the weather.
The advancing Germans pushed the retreating French soldiers and British forces to the port town of Dunkirk. With victory only moments away, Hitler ordered his panzers to halt on the outskirts of the city.
The army was held back in front of Dunkirk because Goering had promised that the Luftwaffe would take care of the whole affair of Dunkirk. But then bad weather came up, and the Luftwaffe was not able to bomb as much as would have been necessary to keep the British troops in Dunkirk.
To save their army, the British launched Operation Dynamo. Starting on May 26, anything that could float sailed from England across the Channel to France and plucked the beleaguered army from the beaches. For 10 days, the Luftwaffe made a determined effort to bomb the stranded troops and sink ships sailing across the Channel. Navy rescued over 238,000 British soldiers and 100,000 French troops, escaping what Winston Churchill feared would be the greatest military disaster in British history.
They left everything there at the beach. Their cars, one car next to the other, almost on top of each other, and a tremendous amount of material. I still remember going there to the beach and finding everything from toothbrushes to sheet music, and they just took their bare life and got out of there.
The Luftwaffe had every reason to be extraordinarily pleased with itself. It had simply overwhelmed all of its opponents. In every instance, its airplanes had been superior to the enemy's, its pilots had had better training, its tactics were more effective. It was at Dunkirk, however, that the Luftwaffe really came up for the first time against the Royal Air Force flying the Spitfires. For the first time, the Germans had an inkling that now this is going to be an opponent of different quality. We're not going to have the easy walkaway that we had in all the previous combinations.
In the bright sunshine of June 21st, 1940, Hitler and Goering met to accept the surrender of the French in the forest of Compiègne. The old railway car was the same car in which the French had accepted the German surrender to end World War I. Hitler and his blitzkrieg had carried the sword of vengeance into France.
When France was defeated, finally, Hitler and Goering thought England would surrender. So Hitler actually went off on a month's vacation. He toured the battlefields, Goering began looting, and the Luftwaffe began refitting and equipping. It was like a gift of life to the Royal Air Force because it had suffered heavy losses in France, and now it had a chance to rebuild.
British industry quickly raised production of their frontline fighters to defend against a possible German invasion. But before Hitler could land troops on English beaches, Goering and his Luftwaffe would have to destroy the Royal Air Force and win air superiority.
Goering gathered all his forces, and it was a formidable force. It had been perfect for Poland, been perfect for France. It was not the right force for the Battle of Britain.
Goering counted on his best fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, to blast the Spitfires out of the sky. The Messerschmitt had fought with the Luftwaffe since the first blitzkrieg against Poland. The fast Bf-109 made mincemeat of its opposition. But taking the fight to England presented an unforeseen problem.
They had to take off from bases in France, fly across the Channel, and when they got into battle, they perhaps had 10 or 15 minutes of combat time before they had to leave, and then they had to fly back across the Channel with their emergency fuel light blinking red.
The Luftwaffe's main assault against the RAF began on August 13th. Codenamed Adler Tag, Eagle Day, the operation called for the bombing of RAF airfields and radar stations along the English coast.
The Spitfire and the Messerschmitt were very, very comparable. The Spitfire was slightly faster and slightly more maneuverable. The Messerschmitt had a better rate of climb and a much better diving capability. And it usually amounted to which pilot was the best pilot.
With the ground radars giving them the course of the incoming bombers, the Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes wasted neither time nor fuel hunting the skies for the formations. Pilot skill decided the result of individual dogfights. The British had the advantage of fighting over home territory. Damaged aircraft were never far from a friendly base. The shot-down pilot was often back in action within hours. By the end of August, disappointed with mounting losses, Göring ordered his fighters and bombers to concentrate their attacks against RAF airfields. The Luftwaffe had not succeeded in blinding British fighter command. The radar network was restored and remained intact. The bomber and fighter attacks against the airfields cost the RAF their greatest casualties. In 2 weeks, the RAF had lost 295 fighters destroyed and 171 damaged. But far more serious was the loss of 103 pilots killed or missing. The escorting Bf-109s fought savagely to protect the slow, ungainly Stukas and twin-engine bombers. The legend of the Stuka perished over England. Despite losing 378 aircraft, the Luftwaffe continued attacks against the airfields. In retaliation for a small British bombing raid on Berlin, Hitler, in a fury, ordered the Luftwaffe against London. On September 7th, the bombers turned away from the RAF airfields and attacked the civilian population of East London. This marked the turning point of the whole battle. British fighter pilots no longer had to fight over their airfields and could concentrate on the great armadas of bombers making their way to London. Without a long-range fighter escort, the Messerschmitts had to operate at the limit of their range and could defend the bombers for only a few minutes over London. On September 15th, vast formations of bombers were attacked. The loss of 60 German aircraft proved to Göring that the goal of air superiority was as far away as ever.
The Germans knew that they had failed in their task. They knew that they were not going to gain air superiority. But even after the Battle of Britain, even after they had suffered their losses, German leadership did not see its way clear to expanding production or to changing the types. They persevered in the same weaponry and in the same levels of production. It's an absolutely unanswerable question why the right conclusions weren't drawn.
As we could see it, the propaganda made it as non-exist, or I would say, well, it was not so decisive. We still were in the feeling that we still had the upper hand in it. Of course, we had no clue.
But losing the Battle of Britain was by no means the end of the assault. The bombing of England continued under cover of darkness.
Over London, when I flew, that was unbelievable how it was going on there as far as flak and balloons. And you saw it started burning, it was just like rolling out a carpet, the way those incendiary little bombs would develop and would start fires below.
But even the Blitz of London did not destroy the British will to resist. Hitler now counted on his submarine force to sink freighters and starve the British into submission. Göring surrendered to Admiral Karl Dönitz, chief of the German Navy, the control of a wing of reconnaissance aircraft. With these 4-engine Focke-Wulf 200s, Dönitz could expand his search for enemy shipping. The Condor, originally designed as a 26-seat passenger airliner, had a range of over 2,200 miles. In 1938, the Japanese asked that one be built for their Navy as a maritime reconnaissance aircraft. That plane proved so successful for the Japanese that the Luftwaffe adapted the aircraft for the same mission. They carried a bomb and a variety of machine guns, even while on reconnaissance missions. These long-range aircraft could not only sink stragglers, but vector available U-boats to the convoys. Initially, their navigation reports could be off by as much as 80 miles, but by keeping the Condor on station, orbiting over the target, the U-boats could find the slow-moving freighters. By the winter of 1940, the Condors had sunk over 90,000 tons of Allied shipping. For the next 3 years, the Condors were, in Churchill's words, the scourge of the Atlantic. The fundamental failing of the Condor was structural weakness and catastrophic wing failures, not only while in flight, but even on the ground. That and the limited payload capability of the Focke-Wulf 200 prevented it from becoming the aircraft that the Luftwaffe desperately required, a long-range heavy bomber. Although weakened by the losses of the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe was being committed to one full-scale offensive after another. By late spring of 1941, German plans called for the invasion of the Mediterranean island of Crete. British and New Zealander forces, after surrendering Greece to the German invaders, had fled south to the island. The Luftwaffe gambled that by using all available paratroopers together, they could strike the island in force, overwhelm the 30,000 defenders, and capture the 3 main airfields. Once the paratroopers had taken the airfields, the Junkers 52 transport aircraft would return with infantry and artillery support. Operation Mercury began on the morning of May 20th as the sky over Crete blossomed with 1,000 parachutes. At first, the very nature of the attack, its terrifying unfamiliarity, had thrown the defenders off balance. But within minutes of the first landings, paratroopers were met by a hail of small arms fire. Several of the parachute units were wiped out before they hit the ground. By late afternoon, it looked like the invading force would be annihilated. The Luftwaffe dive-bombed and strafed the anti-aircraft guns near the airfields and disrupted organized resistance. Transports returned with ground troops to reinforce the German positions. But when the British defenders regrouped, the Germans gained a precarious hold on one of the airfields. On May 26th, the British abandoned their positions and sailed off the island. The victory was costly. Of the 8,500 airborne soldiers, 3,700 had been killed on the first day. 220 of the Junkers transports were destroyed. The price of the invasion startled Hitler to such an extent that he would never again authorize such an operation. Crete was an Allied defeat, but it was also the grave of the Luftwaffe's paratroops. Barely a month later, the Luftwaffe prepared more than half of its entire frontline force of 4,300 aircraft for the largest clash of arms in German history, the invasion of Russia.
the Soviet Union had been authorized by Hitler several months before, and they had disguised the movement of German troops and German airplanes to the Eastern Front quite well, even though Stalin had been advised by the British that the attack was coming, and even though the Soviet commanders had been warned, nothing was done to protect the airplanes.
On Sunday morning, June 22nd, 1941, 117 German armored and infantry divisions rolled forward on a 1,200-mile battlefront into the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe had destroyed 1,200 Russian planes by noon.
In the next several days, the numbers destroyed went down, 800 to 600 to 300, not because the Russians were fighting any better, but because there were simply less airplanes available to shoot up.
By late November, Army and Air Forces had pushed within 19 miles of Moscow. But this was destined to be the limit of the German advance.
When the winter came, we had tremendous difficulties with ice and snow and no clothing, and it was a terrible experience. We lost all our equipment, we lost all our trucks, we were not prepared at all.
The invasion that Hitler boasted would be over in 8 weeks was now bleeding his army of men and materiel. Ragged, freezing, and with their supply lines overextended, the Germans battled a seemingly endless stream of Russian infantry and armor. Russian counteroffensives began to lever the Germans away from Moscow.
What the Germans were unaware of is that the Russians had a vast manufacturing base in the Urals, that they had transported the aircraft factories almost brick by brick on a train, trundle them across the country, and they were able to begin re-erecting the factory just within days of their getting there. And within 3 months of the German invasion, these factories were once again manufacturing airplanes. The Germans had bitten off more than they could chew. They had no idea of the extent of the strength of the Soviet Union.
New, more capable Russian aircraft began to fly against the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force was beginning to lose air superiority.
The Russians induced in great numbers the Ilyushin IL-2, the tank buster. And this was an airplane that did better than the Stuka. It was virtually invulnerable. It was truly a flying tank.
The Ilyushin Stormovik ground attack aircraft tore into the German armor.
The Stormoviks attacked with rockets and heavy guns and made life on Earth hell for the infantry.
And they built them in great numbers. They built something like 36,000 of them during the war. There were only about 8,000 Stukas built during the war.
For the first time, it became apparent that the production of Luftwaffe aircraft was inadequate to sustain a long period of heavy air operations. Support of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps spread even thinner the Luftwaffe's meager resources. The Desert Fox's fight to regain territory lost to the British pulled away aircraft and pilots that were desperately needed on the frozen battlefields in the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe became a fire brigade constantly on emergency call to salvage hard-pressed army units.
Sometimes they would have to land in no man's land and offload the supplies, and then the Germans who were besieged would have to fight their way out to get the supplies from the Russians.
To move army troops and their supplies quickly along the thin front line, the Luftwaffe employed a most unusual aircraft. The Messerschmitt 323 could lift more than 22 tons of cargo, enough to handle all but the heaviest of German armor. 2 7.9mm machine guns in the nose and 2 mounted behind the wings provided protection for the 4-man crew. This Leviathan first flew in 1940 as a glider. In a system known as the Troika Schlepp, 3 bombers pulling together would tow the plane into the air. This configuration proved impractical, and the Messerschmitt's 323s were fitted with 6 radial engines. Its slow cruising speed of 140 miles an hour and immense size made it an easy target. On one disastrous mission flown without fighter escort, 14 of the 323s from a flight of 16 were shot down. By the winter of 1942, the German army concentrated its power on the destruction of the Red Army at Stalingrad. But their advances were turned back by the Soviet counterattacks. The Germans found themselves surrounded. General von Paulus surrendered his army on January 31st, 1943. It was the turning point of the war in the East and removed any hope of a German victory. The defeat at Stalingrad demonstrated that the Luftwaffe still adhered to the battle tactics of blitzkrieg in close support of ground forces. These tactics, brilliantly successful in Poland and France, failed in the great battles of Operation Barbarossa.
Where they were totally lacking was in the ability to reach beyond the front, reach to the Russian manufacturing centers in the Urals and elsewhere, and destroy them. They simply didn't have the airplanes to do it, nor did they have the will to do it. They ignored it.
The morning of December 7th, 1941, sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe. Honoring a pact signed with the Japanese, Hitler and Göring found their Third Reich at war with the most powerful industrial nation in the world.
I remember one day when my father said, America entered the war and we should quit right here and then. Said, this is the end for us because we cannot match their material superiority.
When it became apparent that the Allies were securing both a quantitative and a qualitative advantage, the Germans then turned back to their jet proposals.
We heard some strange noise overhead. If we did see anything, it was just a glimpse of some looked like an aircraft, but it didn't sound like an aircraft. So we asked the flight instructors, what in the hell is this up there?
It was top secret, and we were told not to ask questions, not to shoot at those, since they showed us the shadow models, you know. If you see something like that flying, don't shoot at it, it's ours, you know.
Armed with 4 30mm cannon and underwing rockets, the Messerschmitt Me-262 proved a formidable aircraft. It could not be caught by any Allied fighter in a straight chase and could decimate bomber formations with its heavy cannons.
Now, the Messerschmitt 262 was designed as a fighter aircraft. However, by order of Hitler himself, we are to fly the 262 as a bomber. Nobody had thought that anyone would want to use this aircraft as a bomber.
His concept was that if he had perhaps a couple of hundred Me-262 bombers on D-Day, that they could have disrupted the landings on the beaches. And that's not a bad thought. But it was a misapplication of the airplane. It didn't have a bomb sight. It wasn't very accurate. And it could have been very effective if they'd been manufactured in quantities and used against the bomber formations. Although the Germans built almost 1,300 of the aircraft, only 300 of them ever got into operational situations. Most of them destroyed on the ground.
Throughout 1943, U.S. bomber forces, flying from their bases in England, developed their daylight offensive with pinpoint attacks against German war-making industries. The Luftwaffe turned its full attention to the defense of the Reich.
The task at hand was to do whatever we can to stop the incoming aircraft from reaching their targets. The odds were overwhelming against us. In my group, 27 aircraft would take off, and we would get where we could see them. We then knew that we were outnumbered, maybe 10 to 1, maybe 20 to 1, or even more. we had orders not to ever engage accompanying P-51s. We were to use our time in the air and our ammunition strictly to get down bombers. The only way you can really count on being successful is if you go to the point where your gun sight is black, filled with the enemy aircraft, and then open fire.
Desperate young men with only a few hours in the cockpit of a fighter plane were sent into the cauldron boiling over Germany.
I was just a little past my 16th birthday. The pressures and the stresses were very, very great. I recall being almost at the point of shaking from fear as we were approaching the enemy bomber groups that were coming in. It was then no longer a matter of being a person out of flesh and blood with feelings and all that. It was just like I turned into a machine. It was always 100 or 1,000 aircraft coming in over Germany, and here we were 12, 20, maybe sometimes a few more, trying to do something to stop them. By 1944 and early 45, it was quite evident that it was hopeless.
$1,000 years of unreal human behavior. Hitler, Osama,